Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
It is wonderful to be here celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. But while we're celebrating, we also need to keep in mind the fact that we celebrate because there was a need to pass a Fair Housing Act. And we need to pass a Fair Housing Act because there was obviously unfairness when it came to housing. And it certainly started long before 1965, 1968, and 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. The theme for this afternoon that was in the flyer that was distributed came from a 1956 speech by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. entitled Facing the Challenge of a New Age. He gave this speech in several different places. And the quote that was on the brochure is, the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is the type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding, goodwill, that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. That is a wonderful quote. And that particular statement by Dr. King was made in the same year that there was a bus boycott going on in Montgomery, Alabama. Because on buses in the Montgomery, Alabama city system, as you can see from this picture, colored or black people were supposed to sit in the back of the bus. Everywhere you went in the South, and frankly, in many places that you went in the North, discrimination was not an exception, but the rule. Segregationists, Jim Crow did not leave one stone unturned when it came to making sure people were separated. And I mean to include where people drank their water from and where they did their biologic business of evacuation. I can't even begin to explain to you the psychology that is so obsessed with keeping people separated that it even gets down to where you do your business for the bathroom. That's how absolutely comprehensive they were. And this is from Detroit in 1942. In 1942, during the World War II, specifically in the Sojourner Truth Housing Projects, there was a riot that broke out because black people working in the defense industry simply wanted to have decent housing. And the citizens of Detroit were not trying to have that. And keep in mind also that in 1942, at the very moment that riot broke out over housing in Detroit, Michigan, the arsenal of democracy, Detroit, the arsenal that made the arsenal of democracy be possible to supply the allies overseas. When that riot broke out, we were at the same time fighting one of the most bigoted regimes ever to exist in modern history, the Nazis in Europe, and we had also gone to war against Japan because of Pearl Harbor. As far as the Japanese were concerned, Japan, the nation, did attack us, but there were other people called Japanese Americans who had been here for 3-4 generations, who because of their Japanese ancestry were rounded up and interned in most Western camps. When I say intern, I mean as in put in behind barbed wire in what amounted to relocation camps. Some of them called them concentration camps. So what happened? How do we get here? Especially in a place like the United States of America. How does something like that occur under the red, white, and blue? If any place where it's not supposed to happen on earth, it's America. And I suggest to you that it goes back to the unfinished business of 1787, at the very start, in Philadelphia, at the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution begins with "We the people of the United States." Specifically, it says, "We the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice." And you'll notice they said in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union, more perfect, as in work in progress. In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, common meaning it implies all of us, promote the general welfare, all of us, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It's wonderful language, it's inspirational language, it's aspirational language. But the question that I always put to my students when reading this is, in 1787, who was included in we?
White men.
In 1787, that didn't include women. In 1787, it didn't include Native Americans. In 1787, it didn't include poor whites. There's a class element involved in this too. In 1787, it did not include black people for certain. In fact, the history of discrimination in America involves more than just gender, poor whites, Native Americans, black people. It also included anti-Catholic discrimination. Can you all see that these are people wearing papal vestments right here, looking like alligators crawling ashore? So there was discrimination against Irish immigrants, Catholics, German Catholics, Italians when they came. You can see from this political cartoon in an English magazine, danger to American ideas and institutions, riff-raff immigration. Have you ever heard the phrase that the more things change, the more they stay the same? By the eve of the Civil War, the United States had grown to reflect this map. All these states right here will eventually become the Confederate States of America. America was moving further west. And on the eve of the Civil War, about a month before the Civil War started, the man who would be the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, made a speech in Georgia, or rather in Alabama, where he said the following. The new Constitution, because the South, when they split off from the North, they wrote a brand new Constitution. And he said during that speech, the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization, the prevailing ideas entertained by most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution, the 1787 Constitution, were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Then he went on to say, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone, and you all are volunteers building houses, so you know that the cornerstone is that thing without which the whole structure falls. The cornerstone of this philosophy rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is its natural and normal condition. This was the thinking, the philosophy, and the belief of the South on the eve of the Civil War. The Civil War will be far from April 12, 1861 until April 9, 1865. And believe me when I say that it was war. Historians view it to be the first modern war, not just in the United States, but the first modern war ever in the world. Modern war with the massing of troops, modern wars with the industrial production of machinery, modern war as far as the numbers of men that will be lost in battle, modern war with the level of misery that will be spread, modern war with the depth and breadth of the conflict, modern war and that conflict will be intentionally visited upon civilians, not done, always done in combat, but not done intentionally like it will be during the Civil War. Modern war in every aspect, and that every feature of the state, the economy, politics, industry, society, religion, culture, everything will be channeled into the conflict, to include 186,000 black men who will fight for the Union Army during this war, who quite literally would demand to get into the war because they understand, like Frederick Douglass says, that if they're not allowed to get into the war, the last thing that we wanted to have happen was to have this thing end and slavery be abolished without black people participating because Frederick Douglass said they will forever tell us that we did not earn the right to be free. We must bleed for the opportunity, bleed for the privilege. And what was it that people were fighting about? What could drive Americans to fight for 4 years to the tune of nearly 1 million lives lost? Still, the Civil War claimed more lives than all the conflicts we've ever fought as a nation combined, to include the Iraq War of 1992 and the current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. All those conflicts together still do not add up to the number of Americans lost in the 4-year conflict of the Civil War. What was it they were so angry about? What could possibly move men and women to that level of hostility? And it was slavery. An argument, a disagreement over the right to buy, sell, and dispose of individual human beings at their will. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, and the Civil War was over. But the struggle wasn't over. The next 12 years were called a period of Reconstruction. In that period, the Congress finally passed the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that established due process, dual citizenship, equal protection of the law. This one right here basically modernized the Constitution. And the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. Sadly, women will not have the right to vote until the 20th century. But it didn't last long. Southerners, before the smoke settled and the dust cleared, Southerners were already involved in a process of getting back what they called home rule. They understood that if they could get control of the state houses and state legislatures, in other words, if they could control the vote, they could reassume power, which is exactly what they did, and they did it with a homegrown terrorist organization called the Ku Klux Klan. By the time you get to 1896, there was a black man named Homer Plessy. He was called an octoroon, which means he had 1/8 black blood in him. How in 1896 you figure out he's got 1/8 black blood in 1896, I do not know. But somehow they figured that out. Homer Plessy rode a train on purpose. It's very reminiscent of, or sort of foreshadows, what Rosa Parks was going to do in 1955, 1956, when she purposely sets up a confrontation with the Jim Crow system in Montgomery, Alabama, so that they can take it to court and eventually move it to the Supreme Court. Likewise, Homer Plessy rides in the all-white section of a railroad in Louisiana. He is caught, he's arrested, they take it to trial, it goes to the Supreme Court, and the judgment is this. In 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision in the case of Homer Plessy, a black man from Louisiana. He challenged the constitutionality of segregated railroad coaches, first in the state courts and then in the U.S. Supreme Court. The High Court upheld the lower courts, noting that since the separate cars provide equal services, the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment was not violated. So, it was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, that as long as the services were equal, they could be legally separated. Hence came the doctrine of separate but equal. And we need to understand that separate but equal segregation did not begin here. It's already in force. It was already the tradition of the land. This just legalized it throughout the South. This became the dominant system in the South for the next 70, 80 years. As the 20th century dawned, what you have is a situation of Jim Crow segregation of the South that is comprehensive, it is total, it is oppressive. It is incredible to think that for some of us in our lifetimes, we have seen the vestiges of this. It was everywhere all the time. And I have not even mentioned the fact that the Ku Klux Klan got to be so large and so powerful in the nation that on many occasions they were able to stage marches down Pennsylvania Avenue, yes, as in Washington, D.C., as in, yes, the capital of the United States of America in the 1920s. On Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, initiating something called the Great Depression. It was an economic catastrophe of the first order. Americans were left distraught. They were left homeless, jobless, and penniless. Many people thought that the nation was on the verge of revolution. This woman right here, Florence Owens Thompson, she became the face of the Great Depression. She's only 32 years old in this picture, but look at her. Look at the stress on her face. The Depression was cruel to everyone. And it was during the Depression that the Homeowners Loan Corporation that Liz spoke of was born. One of the first pieces of legislation that was passed by the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was a New Deal agency created to refinance homes and prevent foreclosures. As you can see here, the government agency surveyed real estate trends in the nation's largest cities. They worked with local lenders and realtors, and HOLC assessed neighborhoods. They assessed according to factors ranging from terrain to income levels to infiltration of, quote, low-grade population. That is, African Americans, Jews, and immigrants. Grades were assigned for each neighborhood's residential security. Green, as Liz pointed out, meant you got a good neighborhood. Red meant you got a D, which means you were a failing neighborhood. And then they produced maps for each city showing grades for all areas. She showed you maps for Grand Rapids. But those maps, relative to this information right here, the records were indicated during the years 1933 to 36, 44% of assistance went to native white neighborhoods, 42 went to native white and foreign, and 1% to so-called Negro neighborhoods. This was the color code for the grading scale. Redlining became commonplace. According to uslegal.com, redline was the practice of discrimination based on the racial makeup or character of a person's neighborhood, most often used in the context of extending credit or providing insurance coverage. So obviously, it's not just housing, but housing in conjunction with banking and credit, meaning overall financial, insurance. Insurance redlining is discrimination in the marketing, underwriting, and practicing of homeowners insurance to persons in black neighborhoods. This shows the redline map of Austin, Texas in 1934. But it also occurred in Charlotte, North Carolina. This one from 1935. It also took place in Seattle, Washington, the Pacific Northwest. You wouldn't think the Pacific Northwest, Northwest, yes, but it occurred there too. It took place in Wichita, Kansas, 1936. It took place, again, in Wichita, as you can see from this particular document, it shows description, level, favorable influence, none, detrimental influences, the heavy Negro concentration in Wichita, old, poorly kept, and terribly run down, drainage canal, railroad tracks, and inhabitants, Negroes, some Mexicans, low-class whites. (1939), Los Angeles. So apparently from coast to coast, north and south, the north side of Chicago. No surprises there, Chicago remains a heavily racially divided city today. So when you get into the 1950s and Dr. King is making this speech, another observation he'll make from that presentation, facing the challenge of a new age. Now the fact that this new age is emerging reveals something basic about the universe. It tells us something about the core and heartbeat of the cosmos. It reminds us that the universe is on the side of justice. It says to those who struggle for justice, you do not struggle along, but God struggles with you. About 7 years later, on the Mall in Washington, D.C., looking out from the Lincoln Memorial toward the monument in the distance, they estimated 250,000 people gathered for what's called the March on Washington, or the Poor People's March. It was at this event where King got up and made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It was during that presentation he said, he talked about a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And people kept protesting after the speech into 1964, and 1965, and 1966. And I really need for us to pay attention to the fact that these aren't just black people who are protesting, there aren't just white people who are protesting, these are people who are invested in the cause of justice. Okay? When I'm teaching my students at Hope College, I want them to understand, I'm trying to get them to understand that the pursuit of justice has not been just a black thing. Black people have been heavily impacted. This is true. But we had not been at this by ourselves. And injustice has touched many people other than just black people. And in this photo, you see somebody in Native American wear, women, white, black, otherwise. A major partner in the struggle for justice in the 1960s was President Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th President of the United States. He and King had met on a number of occasions to discuss civil rights, to discuss housing rights, to discuss voting rights. So it was no surprise then, or it was a very celebratory event when on July 2nd, 1964, you see the president signing into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And keep in mind, this was in addition to the 15th Amendment was supposed to have black people having the right to vote. So clearly people did not obey the law relative to the 15th Amendment. So another piece of legislation was passed called the Civil Rights Act, and they gave a pen to King. And then on August 6, 1965, he signed a Voting Rights Act. 3 years later, King was shot down in Memphis, Tennessee. He had gone to Memphis to try and lend his support, lend the weight of his clout, the weight of his influence in a sanitation worker strike. He went down there, and it was interesting that the people who were protesting at that time, they weren't walking around with signs asking for better wages, better hours, and better working conditions, although they did want better wages, hours, and working conditions. But the sign that they were walking around with said very simply, "I am a man." And they had that sign, "I am a man," because their viewpoint was this: if you cannot come to terms with the basic fundamental fact that I am a human being and a man, if you can't agree with that, then we're never going to get to a discussion about my wages, my work conditions, or my hours. Because you have not dealt with the fact that I'm a human being, first and foremost. President Johnson, not wanting to lose the effect, the impact of the shock of King's assassination, signed the Fair Housing Act into law 7 days after King was assassinated. He took the moment of national mourning to do something which, quite frankly, he had not been able to get past up until that point, which should say something about where we were then. How fast fair housing was not going to be reality unless we lost the one who had been the chief expositor of nonviolence. It literally took King's death to get this thing into law. So what do we do? What happened afterward? Where were we supposed to go? What was supposed to happen? King, one of his last speeches, said, "One day we will have to stand before the God of history, and we will talk in terms of things we've done. But it seems that I can hear the God of history saying, 'That was not enough, for I was hungry, and you fed me not.'" He was making reference to the scripture from Matthew 25, verses 34 through 36, when the writer is saying that when the king comes back, when the king comes, he's going to say, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And in verse 40 it says, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Facing the challenge of a new age, how do we do that? He also said, we are challenged to rise above the narrow confines of our individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. This means that no individual or nation can live alone. We must all learn to live together as brothers in this world, or we will perish as fools. Man, through his scientific genius, has been able to dwarf distance and place time in chains. He has been able to carve highways through the stratosphere. In an age in which our world is geographically one, Now we are faced with the challenge of making it spiritually one. Through our scientific genius, we have made of the world a neighborhood. Now, through our moral and spiritual genius, we must make of it a brotherhood. We are all involved in the single process. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And because of that, I think, is why housing, its impact on the one individual, the one family, and then other families around it, the neighborhood, and then therefore the neighborhood surrounding it, what you all are doing, what I've had the privilege of doing on occasion, on some of these build operations, what you're doing is so very important for so many different families. Because when one neighborhood is positively affected, how can the city not positively benefit when one neighborhood becomes up in stability? And these are not fake smiles by these families. These are 3 children who now will have someplace safe to sleep at night and a good school to go to, and parents who are not worrying about them. And that means that parents who are not worrying about them will be able to focus more on each other and keep that family together and rob the system of one statistic. It means people of both genders, whatever orientation, whatever color, whatever background, getting out there to do it, not because they're going to benefit, because they understand that by benefiting someone else, we all are going to benefit. And that we all understand that if you really want to make America great again, make your neighbor great. Put a roof over his or her head. That no matter what your skills are, no matter where you come from, no matter how much time you do or don't have on a site, Habitat can use you. So, if you recall what happened about 2 or 3 years ago down in Charleston, South Carolina, when Mr. Dylan Roof walked in that church, the Mother Emanuel, and blew away those 9 worshipers on a Wednesday at Bible study, his objective was to start a race war. But the good people of Charleston, South Carolina, actually proved they were better than that. They did this. They came together and they supported each other in a time of tragedy, and they showed that hate cannot outdo love. Hate does not have the power of love. They showed that their unity was a lot more in common with them than their divisions were. They had decided to invest in something larger than Mr. Dylan Roof's dark vision for his world and choose the light for their world. So they came together and ignored the color of their biologic wrapping and said, we are a better community than that. We're not going to do that. We want to live in peace as brothers and sisters. So we come together at a place like Habitat for Humanity in the same tradition as the carpenter himself. Is it odd that Jesus was a carpenter building things? No. But then we also come together because we understand that even in his case, a life had to be lost in order for the rest of us to benefit. And the benefit was guaranteed because 3 days later, he got up and walked out of a tomb. So therefore, no matter what's going on out there, as far as systems go, as far as discrimination goes, banking, housing, finance, and so forth, they're there. The fact that we have to have a Fair Housing Act, the fact that we have to have a Fair Housing Center today shows us that the system is alive and well, doing what it's always done, keeping people oppressed. This guarantees, however, that the victory is not with that system, but with the people in this room. And so through this work, and through that history, and because we recognize that history, and we understand the elements of it, and we can connect the dots to find out when it started, how it started, and who's involved, well, we can push back by taking the example of the carpenter. In that way, we finally become we the people. Amen. Thanks.